discussion. I hope my speech is going to tune into some discussions you held yesterday, and it's related to the economy of reproduction. I hope that the title is also not going to mislead you, because it speaks about the matter of taking a choice and the matter of decision, which I'm personally having a problem because I inherited a large archive, and I'm having a problem with multiple reproduction systems and backup systems, which are also at its 8-year-old studio, but the portraiture was really heavily produced, and now we are having problems of trying to preserve some of them and trying to decide which of them should be destroyed for the reason that basically we are making a huge pollution by our own carbon footprint as using these large systems of backing up. And unfortunately, digital photography pollutes even more than analog one was doing, and it's even also weaker inside the system for preservation. So the problem which we are facing at this moment is, at one hand, that we are at a crisis of materials, we are at a crisis of energy, and at the same time we are abusing it by the whole formation of a discipline of art history which goes against life and against life processes of recycling, because we are trying to hold things not to disappear, not to vanish, not to die, and basically we are working on to embalming death constantly by not only recording pictures, but also by trying to preserve them inside museums and archives. So unfortunately, some of this data has been released recently by media art historians, predominantly photography historians, as Andrew Dunday in his recent monograph, Forget Photography, was published last year. He released information which is really scary, and that is that European museums today are holding more than 300 million of pictures, and they are still growing databases by neural networks, and growing databases by selfies being recorded, and all these types of reproductions are mixing up together. It is impossible that any human ever is going to be able to see entire documentation of a single museum. So time-wise, humans do not have a life capacity to follow the documentation they have produced. Only neural networks and computers, for their speed and for the reasons of having a really much larger memory than we do, are able to go through these databases. But the problem is that neural networks and computers do not have something that we do, and that is a possibility to check the originals and reproductions, or to check the epistemic status of the reproduction. So the reproductions we are feeding in might already have gone far away from something that is the original and something that was originally a discipline we dedicated ourselves, and that was an art history, and that was the original art. So we are dealing with copies, and the copies already have slipped the attention of humans, and they went into a complete superficial universe into which they are behaving in their own ways, producing another copies, multiplying and feeding the system, and then might not even be related to the originals anymore. So I would like to go to a discussion which is already old discussion, and it's the discussion in reproductions in visual art. Two theorists were really interesting for me here. It's Helen E. Roberts, who published an article in 1993 and 1995 of the problem of the style of the reproduction and the way that style of the reproduction should be analyzed separately than the original. So basically what she claimed is that the reproduction itself shapes the knowledge of the piece reproduced, because it can provide us with incorrect information, but also by providing us with the incorrect interpretation, it provides us with interpretation of art by itself. So each reproduction has its own style, has its own manner, has its own author, and it should be treated similar way that we are actually treating art, the original art, because it brings knowledge of a reproduction style of a certain era. And of course, we can see it through different types of technical reproductions, being they made by, for example, diapositives or black and white negatives, being made by on the reproduction table, or they were made by using macro lenses on the open air, as it was like an easy way out. Were they made by professional photographers, or they were made by some kind of pretentious curators who wanted to be photographers at that moment, but they're made by art historians who wanted to make a lecture inside the museum and just grabbed and stole the opportunity to have a reproduction, and they were really made by someone into museum who could compare the original with the copy, or they were scanned from the book. And then the scan from the book went and had its own life into interpretation of an art piece. And at the end, we were all finding ourselves in the situation in which we were shocked by the original. I myself was shocked by Kazimir Malevich, a Red Cavalry, when I saw it first time. I didn't know it was that size. So the problem of size is a problem of styles, problem of pastitions. We came through the art in the 80s and till nowadays, and came us with so many variants of truth and so many variants of fakes at the same time, is conditioning our perception of art, or if there is something behind all of these veils and barriers that we can call still art. So Codell writes, and I quote here, "The reproduction can be studied as an object and as medium, a means of communicating a view of the original and of popularizing that original and democratizing art spectating itself. Thus, both material culture and media studies can be deployed in studying reproduction." End of quote, Codell 2010, page 222. But the problem of reproduction doesn't stay here. The problem of reproduction is its invisibility in art history. So it's being used as a tool, but it's never been acknowledged as object itself. So art historians are basically using photographs since the 19th century, and a really good overview was being made by Anthony Hember in the use of photography in 19th century art historians. So he was analyzing how around the year 180, the art history started implemented photographs as a tool, first and primarily for making reproductions of unique pieces that were dangerous to be handled by hand, and they wanted to be shared. And afterwards, they were used in art history education. So since the original call from Peary MacDonald, the path of photography as a medium of instruction in 1905, art historians like Jacob Burckhardt started to accept the challenge, and they started to give their lectures from reproductions. At that moment, reproductions were black and white. So the knowledge of students was black and white. So today, by today, Wolfen was the most recognized for the exciting implementations in photography in his courses, using twin reproductions and comparative reproductions of slides. And due to that systematic recording of photography, numbers of replicas and art pieces accelerated. Of course, today we are facing a mass culture of reproduction, and we are having replicas on really bizarre objects in museums like ashtrays, napkins, toilet paper, and there are masterpieces of art on every possible printable material that can be found, like from pen and notebooks to unfortunate objects like toilet paper. And in all these materials, the reproductions of pieces are changing, and they're entering to our knowledge, or to students' knowledge of the piece of art. So initially, some authors actually started to ridiculize art history as the history of reproduction itself. So the history of not dealing with the original, we're actually starting to speak about sacredity of the original. So one of them was French writer André Malraux, who told that art history is the history of something that can be photographable, but not actually that can be photographed, but not actually of the object itself, because the reproduction itself has emancipated inside the discipline, and without the reproduction, the discipline probably would not exist. It also is the case for natural sciences. Without reproduction, there are plenty of natural sciences that would really have a problem of existing, and also in wider areas of humanist sciences, archaeology, for example, in which the foundation of the discipline is rooted on the reproducibility of the object, but at the same time, a possibility of keeping the material of visual material. I'm currently writing a book on the problem of photography and reproduction of the species that are gone, and the problem and the reason why they've been recorded, and the reason photography has the status inside the various disciplines. So this is like quite close to me. So Other authors who objected to this implementation was Panofsky. Actually, he claimed in his writing on the original and facsimile reproduction in their Cries that trying to defend the reproduction as a possibility to have a copy is better than not having a copy at all, not having a possibility to see anything. So he noted, and I quote, that the reproductive process is divided into two acts. One is mechanical and the other, while equally important, is purely personal, even artistic. 5 years later than this text, Walter Benjamin has wrote his famous article on reproduction and its relationship to the original, which I think we are all familiar with. And this all relates to the area of mechanical reproduction, of chemical reproduction in photography, which is by the quality in the archive still having much better condition than the photography that was made, especially printed, since the mid-20th century, which refers to color photography, C-process printing, and also early digital photography, and which basically destroyed our knowledge of what was reproduced because of different calibrations of colors and different granulations of films, and especially decaying of the material, which was never abandoned at the end, because now we are also keeping material which is completely bleached, material of Polaroids, along with something that is color-changed diapositives and high granulation of film, C-process photographs which went into magenta, and also very bad photographs on solvent materials which are having no colors whatsoever and are having gray veil on the photograph. So this whole period is somehow full of enthusiasm to the reproduction since the 50s onwards, but at the same time dealing with the most lowest quality of the reproduction we have met. And so with this digital reproduction, there are also authors which have been trying to analyze our relationship to the original, because what was the problem of digital reproduction was its multiplicity and multiplication by each process of transfer of the material, but also its utter vulnerability to something which was not known before. And digital reproduction is vulnerable not only on viruses, but it's also vulnerable on human aspect of forgetting passwords to the database and things which are really, despite the number of copies, they are really weird and was never a problem to the analog and hard copy material of the previous age. So Malina was the first, Roger Malina, who was a long editor of the Leonardo Journal in Art, Science and Technology, who went first to analyze the problem of post-mechanical reproduction, and Douglas Davison was digital reproduction. So the most recently, the analysis has been given by Joanna Zielinska, who is a major theorist in post-digital photography, and in her chapter, The Work of Art in the Age of Machinic Creation, she defined the role of artificial intelligence in contemporary arts and culture, and trying to see how these new types of reproductions are working as invisible images and how they are being proliferated by the system. So in addition to the number of copies which have been released as official numbers of archives, plus the invisible images created by neural networks, plus selfie images being uploaded on social networks, plus all the copies and variants of these images, we are reaching numbers which are much higher and much more dangerous than the numbers that have been named by Dundee. And I would try to go to the problem of how to filter and how to approach this mass of reproductions that are coming everywhere, and try to see the possibility of salvation, which will here be a destruction of the archive, and how we can start thinking about erasing and pressing that red button and saying, okay, bye. And so the problem is that many of these images we do not see, and many of these images are not only dangerous to the machines and to memory, but they're also dangerous for neural networks which are seeing instead of us. So we have delegated neural networks to analyze something that previously we were doing. We have delegated them to become the perception and eyes of art historians, but we have not given them space to see and possibility to distinguish really between the original and the copy. Of course, they can do it by the pattern recognition if we drill them to do so. But if we drill them to do the pattern recognition on the wrong type of reproduction, which is always the case and possibility, then we can also make a huge damage. So I will just go briefly through some materials which are, I think you're really familiar with. But that will just serve me to show you how these stratifications can be done. So this is from the most recent article by Frank and Frank. It was published by Leonardo Journal. This is analysis of, the article title was The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Generation. And Frank and Frank, the pair, were writing about paradigm shift in cultural sense in photographic processes, in photographic reproduction, and mainly analyzing the case, which is the most known case of paintings of Rembrandt. As you know that projects like the Next Rembrandt being made by a convolutional network and trying to, which was generating new portraits from portraits that have been dedicated and they've been acknowledged as being Rembrandt original portraits, but also the reconstruction of Rembrandt van Rijn in Night Watch from the fake painting of Night Watch by Gerrit Lundens. And this is also the problem of the replica and reproduction, which is making maybe the bottom line. Here, the fake or the copy was the source for remaking of the originals. So we need some fakes for some originals, and that's the bottom line. But we don't need the number of the copies that we are being dealing with. So this is how the reconstruction was made. I'm pretty sure you've seen all the cases. So I'm going to just skip to the problem I wanted to note. The thing is that if we analyze the system, we can stratify them in epistemic order, and I think that Umberto Eco was the first one to analyze the epistemic order of photographs, trying to distinguish basically the writings according to writings, trying to distinguish writings in regard to Bible in apocrypha, pseudocrypha, and so on. So if someone else in someone's name was writing, if someone else was writing a fake script, if someone was changing the original script, if someone was trying to alter and plumb the author, and so on. So this has been rarely done for the images, although we have the reproduction theory, as I was telling, since the mid of the 19th century. Art historians have been dealing with the reproduction, but not with the epistemic layer of the reproduction, because the reproduction for itself was a medium, not the object. And the problem of the reproduction was it's basically the object occupying the space. Even though it can be a digital object, it still occupies the space. So I would like to propose a system which would go in the layers and epistemic layers of the images and trying to see if we are dealing with first order copies, and first order copies would be in-time copies done by painting or by the author himself. Picasso was the first one who told that he's faking himself, so he was a fake first known forger of Picasso. So the author faking himself, the pupil or student faking the author, the forger faking the author would be the first epistemic layer, because they had been encountering and seeing the original. The photographic reproduction, the original reproduction in the catalog, the quick documentary image, even the accidental image in the museum, is still the first order reproduction, which means the reproduction has been seen originally by someone. It has the witness. Even though the witness can be having perceptual problems, very low quality of the camera, there is a certain relationship between the witness and the thing that has been recorded. But when we come to the second order, and this is the problem when we are feeding neural networks, is we are often dealing with photographs and scans of a printed matter. So we are dealing with the second order material. And in second order material, there is many of problems which can happen to the material. And now, the second order material will be like it's a list. Photographs being the positive or negatives of images done by the author himself. Positives or negatives done by the pupil, photographs, positives or negatives by the forger, scans of catalog reproductions, scans of quick documentary images, and scans of all previous accidental image material. even screenshots. So there is the second order material, and in this type of material, no one has been interrupting the chain between recording and recorded object by observing it, monitoring it, and trying to see differences on being capable of knowing what is the difference in reproduction interpretation. And the third order material would be the material of, again, scans of everything previously said, which is scans of photographs of images done by the author instead, and scans of photographs of images done, and so on, so on, and so on. And we can go on, and the problem is that each time that we are moving the database from one computer to another, we are producing a new file. A new file is having data which is bringing from previous computer. And if it's a JPEG format, it's going to change by this moving. And then we are not producing original reproduction, but we are just producing fourth order, fifth order, sixth order, seventh order material, even though not knowing that we are constantly changing the file. So after some time of the opening of the JPEG formats, after some time of moving of images from one computer to another, files have inevitably changed, and we have produced something that has really hardly anything to do with the original. Now the problem is at which point we would need to cut this type of material, and what would be the basic problems. The problem is that in archiving and musealizing branches, the original eyes of someone who is working are being neglected in the field. So the original archivist and musealist that works inside that room or can compare the original material is the most valuable in this process, because they can say if something really matches the original. And otherwise, we are having problems with scales and ratios, which are childish problems in seeing the reproductions, color gamma, which changes, and usually can be only noticed by the specialist if something is a bit more in cyan or something is a bit more in magenta, it's just for trained eyes. Or if it has more details or less details, and which type of lenses have been used. And of course, there is also a problem of the image condition and humidity of the space and whatever. But also, we can speak on different types of technical details and specific errors that are being made for the interpretation of the reproduction. This has been the most common with actually photography of sculpture. Photography of sculpture has passed in the 70s through the radical aestheticization. So the sculptures being recorded by photographers working in museums have been made more beautiful by the minimalist aesthetics of chiaroscuro than the sculptures are in nature at all. So, for example, when you see more recorded in 70s and 80s, it's much more beautiful in photographs than in reality, because photographers were producing underexposed images and trying to emphasize the chiaroscuro, which his open-air sculptures are not having. So there is this aestheticization and complete change and interpretation by the photographer, which has to be taken into the account, if sometimes, in some cases, photographs are better than the originals. And there is also the problem of the style of reproduction, and the style can change also in print, and it can also change by a decision of curators or editors of the book. But the most problematic problem here would be media ownership and problems of cropping and editing of the pictures. Not only the originals like Rembrandt, but also cropping and editing of reproductions, which you can find online, which are not showing the full size of the objects, because there is always someone who needs to re-edit the image. So mainly what I've seen recently, Vermeer was one of the most corrupt authors. There's constantly someone wants to put him in another frame. So either it be related to a resolution of the screen, which the image has to adapt to, or the problem of the reproduction in print. There is a problem of editing and cropping, and finally there is the problem of the censorship. So at one hand, the censorship, which is going to push some images, at one hand, hide them. There is a problem of prescriptive censorship, which makes the replication of the images, which are wanted ones, and it makes them in variants that are unforeseeable, and that's the problem we are dealing with as well. The censorship, which tries to push the image and proliferate the image, like you have propaganda systems in the Soviet Union in the times of Stalin. Propagating certain type of image makes the replication of the image, and it makes the image having own life, and it is biopolitical life of procreation and covering, basically covering of the original. And so one of the most famous example is the Lenin speech on the Red Square. Many of variants of the same image have been made by paintings, photographs, it's a photo. They've been retouched, cropped, and changed in various conditions. And now we are having all of them inside the archives, and someone has to decide. And the problem is now that each of these neural networks that we are bringing this wave of reproductions to is spending 5 cars lifelong use in the carbon footprint. And also the libraries are as polluters as much because they are using enormous, at this point they are using really enormous memory for maintenance of the archives. And some of the materials we have stolen from the nature, like silver in photographs, are lacking from natural processes. So we have just took them and we have not got them back. It would be fair from art historians, and I'm an art historian, to think about trying to bring some of these materials back to nature and trying to save the nature from the expense of this amount of the energy, because at this point we are training not only neural networks, which are huge polluters in a carbon footprint, but we're also producing various types of filters and applications which some consumers are using in order to make pseudo-Rembrandt and pseudo-Picasso images of themselves. So we are replicating styles, images, and replicating reproductions and producing unsustainable discipline by doing so. So I would just like to close here with basically the very unpopular idea that we should be the most iconoclastic as ourselves and try to embrace the history of destruction in the history of art itself and try to see the iconoclasm as the legitimate brother or sister or a twin to the discipline of art history, and try to do, and without fear, some decisions on erasing and trying to save the nature, of course, and life on the planet. Thank you very much.